There are harbors in the Caribbean that never sleep, places where the living and the dead share the same waters, where the past refuses to stay buried beneath the waves. Nassau is one such place. For 300 years, sailors have whispered about a ship that appears in Nassau harbor once every decade, always on a moonless night, always drifting in silence. A vessel with no crew visible on deck, yet lanterns burning in the darkness and shadows moving just beyond the light. They call it the Phantom of Nassau, and those who have seen it swear it's searching for something or someone. This is a story about betrayal, about greed that infected an entire crew like disease, about a captain's dying curse and the supernatural justice that followed. It's a tale pieced together from old logbooks, faded tavern records, and the terrified testimonies of fishermen who saw things they couldn't explain. Some will tell you it's just legend, sailors' superstition, passed down through generations of rum-soaked nights and storm-rattled nerves. But the records are there. The sightings are documented. And in Nassau, even today, there are those who won't sail on moonless nights, who won't speak certain names aloud, who remember the price of treachery. This is the story of Captain Sealer's Grimshaw, the mutiny that killed him, and the phantom ship that has haunted Nassau harbor ever since. It began in 1714, in an age when piracy ruled the Caribbean and Nassau was the wildest port in the New World. Nassau in the early 18th century was not a place for the faint of heart. It was a pirate republic, a lawless haven where men who'd been branded criminals by every civilized nation could drink, spend their plunder, and plan their next raid without fear of the gallows. The harbor was always crowded with ships, sloops, brigantines, captured merchant vessels refitted with extra guns. The streets were mud and blood and spilled rum, lined with taverns bearing names like the Crow's Nest, the Devil's Dew, and the Drowned Sailor. By day, the port stank of fish and tar and unwashed bodies. By night, it roared with laughter, fighting, and the occasional gunshot. Into this chaos sailed men of every stripe, former naval deserters, escaped slaves who'd found freedom on the account, gentlemen fallen from grace, religious zealots and complete madmen. But among all the captains who made Nassau their home, few were as respected or as feared as Captain Sealer's Grimshaw. Grimshaw was not the richest pirate in Nassau. He was not the cruelest nor the most flamboyant. But he was, without question, one of the smartest. He stood just under 6 feet tall, lean and weathered, with pale grey eyes that seemed to look straight through a man's lies to the truth beneath. His hair was dark, shot through with premature silver, tied back in a simple queue. He dressed plainly compared to other captains, no fancy coats or stolen finery, just practical clothes, well-maintained weapons, and a sharp mind that had kept him alive through a dozen years of piracy. Grimshaw had been a merchant captain once, in his youth, sailing legitimate routes between London and the colonies. But after his ship was seized by corrupt officials who claimed his cargo was contraband, after watching his honest livelihood stolen by men with legal papers and empty consciences, he turned to the only profession where cunning mattered more than connections. He'd taken to piracy like a scholar to books, studying tactics, weather patterns, naval procedures. He could read the sea like a map, predict where merchant ships would sail, and vanish into storms that would destroy lesser captains. He raided with precision, took what he needed, and rarely spilled unnecessary blood. His ship, the Marauder's Wraith, was a 32-gun brigantine, fast and deadly. His crew numbered 63 men, all chosen for skill rather than savagery. They followed him because he made them rich, kept them alive, and treated them more fairly than most pirate captains bothered to. By 1714, Grimshaw had been operating out of Nassau for nearly 8 years. He was respected by other captains, feared by the Spanish, and had earned a reputation as a man whose word could be trusted, at least as much as any pirate's word could be. But trust, in Nassau, was always a fragile thing. It was late summer when the opportunity came. Word reached Nassau through the network of informants and corrupt officials that every pirate captain relied on. A Spanish galleon, the San Cristobal, would be sailing from Havana to Cartagena, carrying an unusual cargo. Not just gold and silver, though there would be plenty of that, but church gold. Treasure collected from a dozen missions and monasteries, blessed by priests and bound for the Archbishop's palace in Cartagena. Crosses, chalices, candlesticks, all solid gold and encrusted with gems. A fortune that would make any crew rich beyond their wildest dreams. But the cargo came with a warning. The priests had blessed the gold with prayers of protection and cursed anyone who might steal it. Sailors were superstitious people, and even pirates hesitated when it came to stealing from churches. Most captains dismissed the opportunity as too risky or too cursed, but Grimshaw saw it differently. To him, a curse was just another form of fear, and fear could be managed like any other risk. He called a meeting with his crew and laid out the plan. They would intercept the San Cristobal off the coast of Cuba, take the treasure, and return to Nassau to divide it fairly according to the articles they'd all signed. Every man would get his share. No one would be cheated. The crew voted, as was their custom. 59 men voted to take the prize. 4 abstained, uneasy about the church gold and its supposed curse. Grimshaw noted their concerns but moved forward. He'd never let superstition stop him before. It was a decision that would damn them all. The attack on the San Cristobal went exactly as planned. Grimshaw's intelligence was perfect. They found the galleon exactly where he'd predicted, sailing alone through calm waters, her escort ships delayed by storms. The marauder's wraith approached under false colors, Spanish flags flying, until they were close enough that resistance was futile. The Spanish captain, seeing he was outgunned and outnumbered, surrendered without a fight. Not a single shot was fired. No blood was spilled. It was the kind of clean operation that Grimshaw preferred. His men boarded the galleon and began hauling the treasure across to the marauder's wraith. Chest after chest of gold coins, bags of pearls and uncut gems, and the church gold packed carefully in wooden crates lined with velvet, crosses that glittered in the Caribbean sun. Chalices so heavy with gold and jewels they required 2 men to carry. It was more wealth than any of them had seen in years. As the transfer continued, Grimshaw spoke with the Spanish captain, a gray-haired man named Rodrigo Delgado, who watched the pillaging with weary resignation. Delgado said, "You're making a grave mistake, Captain." Grimshaw replied, "I'm making my crew rich. That's my job." Delgado shook his head and said that gold was blessed by Father Tomás himself, a man who spent 40 years in service to God. He blessed it for protection and cursed any thief who touched it. You think yourself immune to the judgment of heaven? Grimshaw said calmly, "I think I'm immune to threats from men who use God as a weapon. Your priests blessed this gold to protect it from people like me. Well, their blessings failed. That's not my concern." Delgado looked at him with something like pity and said, "The gold is not what will destroy you, Captain. It's what it will do to your men. Gold blessed by God or cursed by him, it doesn't matter. It will reveal what kind of men they truly are. And I don't think you'll like what you see." Grimshaw dismissed the warning. He'd heard every threat, prophecy, and curse imaginable in his years at sea. Words meant nothing. Actions did. And his action was to take this treasure and make his crew the richest pirates in Nassau. The San Cristobal was released unharmed, her crew locked below decks with enough provisions to reach the nearest port. By sunset, the marauder's wraith was sailing away, her holds full of the most valuable cargo Grimshaw had ever taken. The crew celebrated that night, toasting their captain's brilliance and their own good fortune. They sang shanties, shared rum, and counted their shares in their heads. But below deck, in the hold where the church gold sat in its velvet-lined crates, something had already begun to change. The first sign of trouble came 3 days later. One of the crew, a young sailor named Thomas Webb, approached Grimshaw on the quarterdeck looking troubled. Webb said, "Captain, I need to speak with you privately." They moved away from the other men, and Webb spoke in a low voice. He said, "Some of the men are talking, sir, about the gold, about the shares." Grimshaw frowned and asked, "What about the shares? Everyone knows the articles. Every man gets his portion based on rank and role. We've done this a dozen times." Webb hesitated, then said, "They're saying that the church gold should be divided differently, that it's worth more than regular plunder, and that those who did the most dangerous work, who boarded the galleon first, deserve larger shares." Grimshaw's jaw tightened. This kind of talk was poison on a ship. Fair division was the only thing that kept a pirate crew from tearing itself apart. He asked, "Who's leading this talk?" Webb answered reluctantly, "The quartermaster, sir, Jonas Pike." Jonas Pike was Grimshaw's second in command, the man responsible for discipline and for representing the crew's interests. He'd sailed with Grimshaw for 5 years, a competent officer, good with numbers and logistics. A bit ambitious, perhaps, but Grimshaw had never thought him disloyal. Grimshaw said, "Thank you for telling me, Webb. Keep your ears open and let me know if you hear anything else." That evening, Grimshaw confronted Pike in his cabin. Pike was a stocky man with a thick black beard and calculating eyes. He sat across from Grimshaw with an expression of mild surprise. Grimshaw said directly, "I hear you've been talking to the crew about changing the division of shares." Pike replied smoothly, "Not changing, Captain, just discussing. The men have questions, and it's my job to ask those questions on their behalf. That's what a quartermaster does." Grimshaw leaned forward and said, "The articles are clear. Everyone knows their share. There's nothing to discuss." Pike spread his hands and said, "But Captain, this isn't ordinary plunder. This is church gold, blessed and cursed. It's dangerous cargo. Some of the men feel that danger deserves compensation beyond the standard shares." Grimshaw asked coldly, "And what do you feel, Jonas?" Pike met his eyes and said, "I feel that we're all rich men already. But I also feel that when men start thinking they're not getting what they deserve, ships start having problems. I'm just trying to prevent those problems." Grimshaw said, "Then here's how you prevent them. You go to the crew and remind them that we all agreed to the articles before we took this prize. Fair shares, voted on and accepted by all. Anyone who has a problem with that can state their case at the next crew meeting when we reach Nassau. Until then, we sail as we always have." "Understood." Pike nodded and said, "Understood, Captain." But as he left the cabin, Grimshaw saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, something dark and hungry. The Spanish captain's warning echoed in his mind. The gold will reveal what kind of men they truly are. Over the next week, the atmosphere aboard the Marauder's Wraith changed. The easy camaraderie that had always existed among the crew began to fracture. Men formed small groups, whispering in corners and going silent when officers approached. Arguments broke out over minor things, work details and rum rations. There were 2 fistfights that had to be broken up, both over petty slights that wouldn't have mattered a week earlier. And always, Jonas Pike was there, moving among the men, talking quietly, listening to their complaints, fanning flames that Grimshaw was desperately trying to extinguish. Grimshaw called another officer meeting with his most trusted men. His first mate, Marcus Reed, a scarred veteran who'd been with him since the beginning. His sailing master, William Chen, a brilliant navigator who could find any port in any weather. And his gunner, Samuel Hodge, a former Royal Navy man who knew cannons better than any pirate in the Caribbean. Grimshaw said, "We have a problem. The crew is turning sour and Pike is making it worse." Reed said, "I've seen it too. He's working them up, making them think you're planning to cheat them. It's textbook mutiny preparation, sealers." Chen added, "We're 4 days from Nassau. Can we make it without incident?" Grimshaw replied, "I don't know. If Pike has convinced enough of them, they might move before we reach port. They'll want to take the gold and scatter, avoid any official division." Hodge asked, What are our options? We can't fight half the crew. Reed said grimly, we could put Pike in irons. Charge him with incitement. Let the crew vote on his punishment. Grimshaw shook his head and said, that could trigger exactly what we're trying to avoid. If enough of them support him, they'll see it as tyranny and mutiny anyway. Chen suggested, what if we divide the gold now, at sea, before we reach Nassau? Give everyone their shares immediately. Remove the temptation. Grimshaw considered this and said it might work. If they have their gold in hand, there's no reason to mutiny. I'll call for a crew vote tomorrow. But tomorrow never came. That night, under a blood-red moon that hung low over the Caribbean like a wound in the sky, Jonah's Pike made his move. Grimshaw was in his cabin, updating the ship's log by candlelight, when he heard the sound of boots on the deck above. Too many boots moving with too much purpose. He reached for his pistol, but the door burst open before he could draw it. Jonah's Pike entered, flanked by 6 armed men. His face was hard, all pretense of loyalty gone. Grimshaw said quietly, so this is how it ends, Jonah's. Mutiny. Pike replied, not mutiny, Captain, justice. You've been planning to keep the lion's share of that church gold for yourself. We all know it. You were going to wait until Nassau, divide it in some private meeting, and pocket half before anyone could count it. Grimshaw stood slowly and said, that's a lie, and you know it. I've never cheated this crew, not once in 8 years. Pike sneered and said, you're a clever man, Grimshaw. That's why you've gotten away with it for so long. But this time, the prize is too big. We're not letting you steal from us. Grimshaw looked past Pike to the other men and said, you believe this? After everything we've been through? After I've made you all rich and kept you alive? One of them, a man named Harris, looked uncomfortable but said, we just want what's ours, Captain. No more, no less. Another, a sailor called Black Tom, said, Pike showed us the numbers. Your share is 3 times what any of us get. That's not fair. Grimshaw said sharply, my share is larger because I'm the captain. I plan the raids, I take the risks, I deal with the Navy and the hunters. That's how it's always been. That's what you all voted for when you signed the articles. Pike said, the articles don't apply to cursed gold. This is different. Grimshaw said, the only curse here is greed, and you've infected this crew with it. Pike's face darkened and he said, enough talk. Men, take him. They moved forward. Grimshaw drew his pistol and fired, hitting one of them in the shoulder. But before he could draw his cutlass, they were on him. 5 men against 1. He fought hard, landing punches and kicks, breaking one man's nose and another's ribs. But there were too many. They pinned him against the desk, wrenched his arms behind his back. Pike stepped forward, drawing a long knife from his belt. Pike said, I almost admire you, Grimshaw. You really did believe you were smarter than all of us. But in the end, gold makes equals of everyone. Grimshaw, breathing hard, blood running from a split lip, said, you'll never reach Nassau, Pike. The sea remembers treachery. It always does. Pike laughed and said, the sea doesn't care about us, Captain. It takes everyone equally. You taught me that. He raised the knife. Grimshaw said one last time, you're making a mistake. That gold is cursed, just like the Spanish captain warned. It's already poisoned you, and it will destroy you all. Pike drove the knife into Grimshaw's chest. The pain was instant and overwhelming. Grimshaw gasped, tasted copper, felt his legs give way. The men dragged him up to the deck. The entire crew was there, watching in silence. Some looked guilty. Others looked hungry. None stepped forward to help. Pike addressed them and said, Captain Grimshaw refused to divide the treasure fairly. He attacked us when we questioned him. Under the pirate code, the penalty for cheating your crew is death. All in favor. A forest of hands went up, not all of them, but enough. Pike nodded and said, then it's done. Cast him over. They dragged Grimshaw to the rail. He was dying already, could feel his life leaking out with every heartbeat. But he had just enough strength left for one final act. As they lifted him to throw him over, Grimshaw locked eyes with Jonah's Pike and spoke. His voice was quiet, but every man on deck heard it clearly. Grimshaw said, "You'll never reach Nassau, Pike. None of you will. The sea will remember what you've done here, and it will claim every man who stood by and did nothing. You'll drift these waters forever, searching for peace you'll never find. That's my curse, and it will follow you beyond death itself." Pike's face paled slightly, but he said, "Throw him over." They did. Captain Sealer's Grimshaw hit the water with barely a splash. The weight of his wounds pulled him down immediately. He sank into the dark Caribbean waters, the blood-red moon the last thing he saw before the waves closed over his head. And as the sea took him, something changed. The wind, which had been steady, died completely. The water, which had been choppy with small waves, went perfectly flat, and the air grew cold, far colder than any Caribbean night should ever be. Jonas Pike stood at the rail, staring down at where Grimshaw had vanished. Around him, the crew began to murmur uneasily. Someone said, "Did you feel that? The wind just stopped." Another said, "It's too quiet. Seas are never this quiet." Pike shook off his unease and said loudly, "It's just weather. Get back to work. We sail for Nassau at dawn. Every man will get his share of that gold. I give you my word." But as he walked back to the captain's cabin, now his cabin, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. Below deck, in the hold where the church gold sat in its crates, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. Frost was forming on the wooden walls, and from somewhere deep in the ship, a sound echoed. Soft at first, then growing louder, the sound of chains dragging across a wooden deck. For 2 days, the Marauder's Wraith sailed northwest toward Nassau under Jonas Pike's command. But from the beginning, things weren't right. The wind remained dead. The sails hung limp, forcing the crew to row with oars, exhausting work in the Caribbean heat. But despite the sun beating down, the air around the ship stayed unnaturally cold. The compass began behaving strangely. The needle would spin wildly, then point in directions that made no sense. Chen, the sailing master, recalibrated it 3 times, but it continued to malfunction. And every night, the crew heard sounds from below deck, footsteps where no one was there, the rattle of chains, a voice, faint and distant, calling out words no one could quite understand. Men started having nightmares. They would wake screaming about drowning, about hands pulling them down into dark water, about grey eyes staring at them from the depths. On the 3rd day, one of the crew, a man named Jenkins, was found dead in his hammock. No marks on him, no sign of violence. His face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, and his skin was ice cold despite the tropical heat. Pike ordered the body sewn into canvas and dropped overboard, but the crew was rattled. That night, Marcus Reed confronted Pike in the captain's cabin. Reed said, "We need to turn back. Something's wrong with this ship." Pike replied, "Nothing's wrong. The wind will return. The compass will sort itself out. We just need to keep moving." Reed said, "A man died today for no reason. The crew is terrified. They're saying Grimshaw's curse is real." Pike slammed his hand on the desk and said, "There is no curse. Grimshaw was a clever man, but he wasn't a sorcerer. He's dead. That's the end of it." Reed asked, "Then how do you explain what's happening? The cold, the sounds, the nightmares." Pike said, "Guilt, fear, superstition. The crew is spooked because they feel bad about what we did. Once we reach Nassau and divide the gold, it'll all blow over." Reed studied him and said quietly, "You really believe that?" Pike met his eyes and said, "I have to." On the 4th night, the fog came. It rolled in from the east just after sunset, thick and luminous, glowing with a faint greenish light that seemed to come from within. It swallowed the ship completely, reducing visibility to a few feet in any direction. The temperature dropped even further. Men's breath misted in the air. Ice formed on the rigging. And in the fog, they began to see shapes. Figures, tall and dark, moving silently through the mist. Always at the edge of vision, never quite clear enough to identify. The crew huddled together on deck, no one willing to go below. Pike ordered lanterns lit, but the light seemed to be swallowed by the fog, creating eerie pools of dim illumination that made the shadows worse. Chen approached Pike and said, "We need to drop anchor. We can't navigate in this. We could hit rocks, run aground." Pike said, "No. We keep moving. Nassau can't be far now." Chen protested, "The compass is useless. I don't even know which direction we're going. We could be sailing in circles." Pike shouted, "Then row harder. We're not stopping." But even as he gave the order, the crew at the oars began crying out. The oars wouldn't move. They were hitting something solid beneath the water, something that shouldn't be there. Samuel Hodge leaned over the rail with a lantern and called out, "There's something down there." In the water, men rushed to the rail. By the faint light of the lanterns and the glowing fog, they could see shapes beneath the surface. Long, dark shapes that moved slowly around the hull. Someone whispered, "What is that?" "Fish. Sharks." Another said, "Too big for fish, too slow for sharks." And then one of the shapes surfaced. It was a body, pale, bloated, eyes open and milky white. It bumped against the hull, then slowly rotated, revealing a face. It was Captain Sealer's Grimshaw. Several men screamed. Others stumbled backward, falling over equipment and each other. The body shouldn't have been there. They were hundreds of miles from where Grimshaw had gone overboard. And bodies didn't look like that after 4 days in the water, not in the Caribbean where sharks and sea life would have consumed it. But there it was, unmistakable. The same pale grey eyes, now clouded in death. The same dark hair. The knife wound in his chest clearly visible. And as they watched in horror, the body's hand reached up and grabbed the rail. Men scattered, shouting and cursing. Pike drew his pistol and fired into the water. The shot was deafening in the fog, but when the smoke cleared, the body was gone. But now there were more shapes surfacing. Dozens of them, all pale, all moving. And they were climbing. The dead were boarding the ship. Panic erupted. Men ran in every direction, grabbing weapons, climbing the rigging, some even throwing themselves over the opposite rail to escape. Pike stood frozen, his pistol still smoking in his hand, as a figure pulled itself over the rail in front of him. It was Grimshaw, but not quite Grimshaw. His skin had the pale grey colour of something that had spent too long underwater. His clothes hung in tatters. Seaweed was tangled in his hair, but his eyes, those grey eyes, were alert and aware. He looked at Pike and spoke. His voice was like wind through a graveyard. Grimshaw said, "You were right, Jonas. The sea doesn't care about us. It takes everyone equally. And now it's taking you." Pike raised his pistol and fired. The ball struck Grimshaw square in the chest, right where the knife wound was. It passed straight through, leaving a hole that didn't bleed. Grimshaw didn't even flinch. He stepped forward and said, "You can't kill a dead man, Jonas. You should know that." Pike stumbled backward, terror overwhelming the greed and ambition that had driven him to mutiny. He turned and ran. All around the ship, the dead were rising. Not just Grimshaw, but others. Men who had died on previous voyages, sailors lost to storms and battles. All of them pale, all of them silent, all of them moving with terrible purpose. The crew fought them with cutlasses and pistols and bare hands, but their weapons did nothing. The dead couldn't be killed because they were already gone. One by one, the mutineers were dragged to the rails and thrown over. Their screams echoed through the fog, then abruptly cut off as they hit the water. Marcus Reed found himself cornered near the mainmast by 3 of the dead. He raised his cutlass, but couldn't bring himself to swing. One of the figures stepped forward. It was Webb, the young sailor who had warned Grimshaw about Pike's scheming. He'd been killed during the mutiny, run through when he tried to defend the captain. Webb's ghost looked at Reed and said, "You didn't stop it, Marcus. You knew it was wrong, but you didn't stop it." Reed dropped his cutlass and said, "I'm sorry. God help me, I'm sorry." Webb said, "God isn't listening out here. Only the sea is listening, and the sea remembers." He reached out and touched Reed's chest. Reed gasped as cold, worse than any cold he'd ever felt, spread through his body. His heart stuttered, then stopped. He was dead before he hit the deck. All across the ship, the same scene played out. The dead claimed the living, one by one, until the deck was empty except for Jonah's Pike. He'd barricaded himself in the captain's cabin, pushing the heavy desk against the door, loading every pistol he could find. But he could hear them out there, footsteps on the deck, the sound of the door being tested. Then Grimshaw's voice came through the wood. Grimshaw said, "You can't hide, Jonas. The sea has claimed this ship. It claimed it the moment you threw me over. You just didn't know it yet." Pike shouted, "Leave me alone. Take your curse and leave me alone." Grimshaw said, "This isn't about curses, Jonas. This is about justice. You betrayed your captain. You murdered your shipmates. You let greed poison everything we'd built. There's a price for that. The sea demands it." Pike screamed, "I'll throw the gold over, all of it, every piece. Just let me go." Grimshaw's voice was almost gentle when he replied. He said, "The gold doesn't matter anymore. It never really did. What matters is what you did, what you chose, and choices have consequences." The door exploded inward, the desk flying aside like it weighed nothing. Grimshaw stood in the doorway, water dripping from his tattered clothes, his grey eyes fixed on Pike. Pike fired every pistol he'd loaded, one after another, 6 shots that all passed through Grimshaw without effect. Then he drew his knife, the same one he'd used to kill Grimshaw, and charged. Grimshaw caught his wrist effortlessly and said, "You don't deserve a quick death, Jonas. You deserve to understand what you've done. So I'm giving you a gift." Pike struggled, but Grimshaw's grip was iron. He said, "What gift? What are you talking about?" Grimshaw said, "Life. You wanted to reach Nassau so badly, then reach Nassau, but you'll do it alone, with the memory of every man you killed, every friend you betrayed. You'll live with it, Jonas, every day, until you can't bear it anymore." He released Pike and stepped back. Pike stood there, confused, the knife still in his hand. Around him, the ghosts of his crew watched in silence. Grimshaw said, "Go. The longboat is waiting. Row to shore. Live your life. Grow old. Prosper. But know that we'll be waiting. And when your time comes, when you finally close your eyes for the last time, we'll be there. And then you'll sail with us. Forever." The ghosts parted, creating a path to the door. Pike didn't hesitate. He ran. He scrambled to the longboat, cut the ropes, and dropped into the water. He rowed with desperate strength, not looking back, as the fog closed around the marauder's wraith. By the time the sun rose, burning away the fog, the ship was gone. The sea was empty. Jonas Pike floated alone in his longboat, exhausted and half-mad, the shore of Nassau visible in the distance. He made it to land. He survived. But survival, he would learn, was its own kind of curse. Jonas Pike lived in Nassau for 43 years after the mutiny. He used the gold he'd hidden in the longboat before escaping to buy a tavern near the harbour. He called it the Sailor's Rest, and it became a moderately successful establishment, frequented by merchants and sailors and the occasional pirate. Pike never married. He rarely left the tavern. He grew old there, serving drinks and keeping his head down, speaking to no one about his past. But everyone in Nassau knew his story. The survivor of the marauder's wraith. The quartermaster who'd lived when his entire crew died. Some whispered that he'd betrayed them. Others said he'd just been lucky. But no one asked him directly. There was something in his eyes that discouraged questions. Pike lived with nightmares. Every night he dreamed of the fog, the dead rising from the water, Grimshaw's pale face and cold judgment. He woke screaming often enough that he eventually moved his bed to the cellar, away from the rooms he rented out, so customers wouldn't hear. He drank, but never to excess. He feared losing control, feared what he might say or do if his guard dropped. He maintained his tavern with meticulous care, as if staying busy could keep the memories at bay. But there were times when the memories broke through anyway. Every year, on the anniversary of the mutiny, Pike would close his tavern and lock himself in the cellar. He'd sit there in the dark, surrounded by barrels of rum and crates of supplies, and wait for the night to pass. Because every year on that night he heard things. footsteps on the floor above when the tavern was empty, the creak of wood that sounded too much like a ship's deck, the distant sound of chains rattling, and sometimes, if he listened carefully, a voice. Grimshaw's voice carried on the wind through the gaps in the walls. "Still alive, Jonas. Still hiding. We're patient. We can wait." The locals noticed Pike's strange behavior, and stories began to circulate. They said that on certain nights, when the moon was dark and the fog rolled in from the sea, you could see a ship in Nassau harbor. A ghostly brigantine with tattered sails and lanterns burning green. It would drift silently into the port, moving against wind and current, and anchor just offshore. And if you watched long enough, you'd see figures on deck. Pale figures that moved in the darkness, seeming to search for something they couldn't find. The ship never stayed long. By morning it was always gone, leaving only calm water and a lingering sense of unease. They called it the Phantom of Nassau, and they said it was looking for someone. The one man who'd escaped the curse. The one man who still lived. As Pike grew older, his fear intensified. He became paranoid, convinced that every fog was bringing the phantom ship, every shadow was one of the dead come to claim him. He stopped going near the harbor. He hired men to run errands for him, so he wouldn't have to leave the tavern. His customers noticed the change. The few friends he'd made began to avoid him, unsettled by his constant nervousness, his habit of staring at nothing and whispering to himself. One evening, a young sailor who'd rented a room at the tavern came down to the main room and found Pike sitting at a table, staring out the window at the harbor. The sailor said, "Mr. Pike, are you all right?" Pike didn't look at him. He said, "Do you see it?" The sailor looked out the window. It was a moonless night, and fog was rolling in from the sea. He said, "See what, sir?" Pike whispered the ship. "It's out there. They're coming." The sailor saw nothing but fog and darkness. He said, "There's no ship, Mr. Pike. It's just fog." Pike finally looked at him, and the sailor was shocked by the terror in his eyes. Pike said, "You're young. You don't know, but I know. They've been waiting 40 years. And tonight, I think they're done waiting." He stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair, and hurried toward the cellar door. The sailor heard him descending the stairs, heard the sound of the heavy door being barred from inside. The next morning, Pike didn't emerge. His workers found the cellar door still barred. They called out, but no one answered. Finally, they broke it down. Jonas Pike was sitting against the far wall, surrounded by old barrels. In his hand, clutched so tightly they had to pry his fingers open, was a single gold coin. Spanish gold, stamped with a cross. The same gold from the San Cristobal, the cursed church gold that had started everything. Pike was dead. His face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, his eyes wide and staring at something no one else could see. His skin was ice cold, despite the Caribbean heat, and around his neck, clearly visible, were marks. Rope burns as if he'd been hanged, but he'd been alone in a locked cellar. There was no rope, no way anyone could have entered. The doctor who examined the body could find no cause of death. His heart had simply stopped. But the expression on his face, the rope burns, the impossible cold of his skin, all of it defied explanation. They buried Jonas Pike in the town cemetery, in an unmarked grave at his own previous request. No one spoke at the funeral. Few attended. The man had lived 43 years in Nassau, but had made no real friends, had touched no lives with kindness or warmth. He'd simply existed, day after day, carrying his guilt and his fear, until both had finally consumed him. The night of his burial, fishermen reported seeing the phantom ship again. It appeared in Nassau harbor just after midnight, drifting silently through the fog. But this time, something was different. The ship didn't just anchor and vanish. This time, as witnesses watched from shore, a figure climbed over the rail and fell into the water. Not thrown, not dragged. It simply fell, as if all strength had left it. And then the ship began to move. It turned slowly, its tattered sails catching a wind that no one on shore could feel, and sailed toward the harbor mouth. One old fisherman, a man who'd spent 60 years on these waters and had seen the Phantom ship half a dozen times over the decades, watched it go with tears in his eyes. Someone asked him, "Is it leaving? Is it finally leaving?" The old fisherman nodded and said, "Their quartermaster is aboard now. The crew is complete. They can rest." The young man who'd asked looked confused. He said, "But where are they going?" The fisherman replied, "Wherever cursed ships go when their business in this world is done. Somewhere far from here. Somewhere beyond the living world. They've been trapped between life and death for 40 years, unable to move on without the man who betrayed them. Now they're free to go." The Phantom ship sailed into the darkness beyond the harbor mouth, its green lanterns growing fainter and fainter until they disappeared entirely. It was never seen again. The story should have ended there. The mutineers reunited in death, finally able to move on to whatever awaited them. Jonah's Pike paying the ultimate price for his betrayal. Justice, of a sort, finally served. But stories like this never quite end cleanly. In the years that followed Pike's death, the Sailor's Rest Tavern changed hands several times. Each new owner tried to make a success of it, but none lasted long. They all reported the same problems. Strange sounds from the cellar, customers complaining about cold spots in certain rooms, a general sense of unease that drove away business. Eventually, the building was abandoned. It still stands today, though it's been repurposed several times over the centuries. Each time someone tries to renovate it, workers report strange occurrences. Tools going missing, unexplained drafts, the feeling of being watched. And in the cellar, where Jonah's Pike spent his final moments, there's a spot on the wall where frost forms even in the height of summer. No amount of insulation or heating can keep it away. It's always there, a small patch of ice-cold stone in the shape of a hand. As for Captain Sealer's Grimshaw and his crew, their fate remains a mystery. The Marauder's wraith was never found. No wreckage washed ashore. The ship, its dead crew, and its cursed cargo simply vanished from history. But sailors in the Caribbean still tell stories. They speak of ships that appear on moonless nights in waters where no ships should be. Ghost vessels that drift silently past, their crews visible as pale shadows on deck. And if you're close enough, if the wind is right, you can sometimes hear them. The sound of men singing shanties, the creak of rigging, the splash of oars in calm water. They say these are the crews of cursed ships, condemned to sail forever for their crimes. The Marauder's wraith among them, Captain Grimshaw at the helm, his grey eyes scanning the horizon for threats that will never come, his crew working sails that will never take them home. Some believe they're in hell. Others say they're in purgatory, working off their sins through endless service. A few romantic souls insist they're actually free, blessed to sail forever doing the only thing they truly loved, unburdened by hunger, thirst, age, or fear. No one knows for certain. And perhaps that's the most haunting part of all. The records of the San Cristobal's plundering exist in Spanish colonial archives. The ship arrived in Cartagena months late, her crew traumatized, reporting that English pirates had stolen the church gold. The priests were furious. The archbishop declared the thieves eternally damned. Whether their curse combined with Grimshaw's to create something worse than either alone, or whether the supernatural events were simply the result of guilt and superstition manifesting in unexplainable ways, we'll never know. What we do know is this. In 1714, a pirate ship called the Marauder's Wraith left Nassau to raid a Spanish galleon. 63 men sailed out. One man came back. And for 40 years afterward, a phantom ship appeared in Nassau harbor like clockwork, always on moonless nights, always searching. And now it's gone. But the story remains, passed down through generations of sailors and locals, each adding their own embellishments, their own interpretations. The core truth, though, stays consistent. Betrayal has consequences. Greed destroys bonds that should be unbreakable. And the sea, vast and ancient, and utterly indifferent to human concerns, has a way of balancing the scales. Captain Grimshaw understood that. He'd spent his life studying the sea, respecting it, working with it rather than against it. When his crew betrayed him, when Jonah's Pike's greed infected them all, Grimshaw didn't curse them with magic words or supernatural power. He simply reminded them of what they'd forgotten, that the sea remembers, that actions have consequences, that you can't outrun what you've done. The fog, the cold, the dead rising from the water, whether those were real supernatural events or mass hallucination brought on by guilt and fear and the strange psychology of isolated men, they served the same purpose. They forced the mutineers to confront what they'd done. They made escape impossible. And Jonah's Pike, allowed to live, carried that confrontation with him for 43 years. Every day a reminder, every night a nightmare. No escape, no peace, no redemption. Just existence, stretched out like torture, until death finally claimed him and the phantom ship could complete its crew. It's a story about justice, not the clean, legal justice of courts and trials, but the messy, inexorable justice of natural consequences, the kind that finds you eventually, no matter how far you run or how well you hide. There's a reason this story has persisted for 300 years, why it's still told in Nassau's bars and repeated by sailors across the Caribbean. Because it touches something universal. We all know what it's like to betray someone, to let greed or ambition override loyalty, to make the wrong choice and then have to live with it. We've all been Jonah's Pike, at least in small ways, and we've all wondered if there's a reckoning coming, if the things we've done wrong, the people we've hurt, the trust we've broken, if all of that is waiting somewhere ahead, ready to collect what we owe. The Phantom of Nassau tells us that yes, the reckoning comes. Maybe not as a ghost ship crewed by the dead. Maybe not as supernatural revenge. But it comes. It comes in the quiet moments when you can't sleep, in the relationships that never quite recover, in the person you see in the mirror who isn't quite who you wanted to be, in the opportunities lost because people learned they couldn't trust you. The sea remembers, Grimshaw said. And maybe that's true in more than the literal sense. Maybe the world remembers. Maybe we remember, deep in our bones, the things we've done and the price we'll eventually pay. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe the curse isn't supernatural at all. Maybe it's just the obvious outcome of obvious choices. Betray your crew, lose their trust. Murder your captain, lose your peace of mind. Choose gold over honor, lose both in the end. The Phantom of Nassau is a ghost story, but like all the best ghost stories, it's really about the living, about the choices we make and the weight we carry, about guilt and consequences and the impossibility of true escape. Jonah's Pike survived the mutiny. He lived for 40 more years. He had decades to reflect, to change, to somehow make amends for what he'd done. But he never did. He just hid. And hiding isn't the same as healing. Running isn't the same as redemption. In the end, the phantom ship came for him anyway. Whether it was real or just his guilt finally overwhelming him, whether he died of fear or supernatural vengeance, it doesn't matter. He died alone, clutching stolen gold, his face frozen in terror, marked by rope burns that shouldn't have been possible. The crew he betrayed found him. The captain he murdered claimed him. And whatever peace he might have found in life, he lost it the moment he drove that knife into Grimshaw's chest. That's the real curse. Not the ghost ship, or the supernatural cold, or the fog that glows green. The real curse is living with what you've done, carrying it every day, knowing that no amount of time or distance or new identity will ever truly let you escape. The Phantom of Nassau doesn't haunt the harbor anymore. The sightings stopped after Pike's death. But the story remains, passed down from generation to generation, a warning wrapped in supernatural dressing. Choose wisely, treat others fairly, honor your agreements, because the sea remembers, and so do we all. Thank you for listening to this tale of betrayal, cursed gold, and supernatural justice. The Phantom of Nassau is one of the Caribbean's most enduring legends, rooted in the real history of piracy's golden age, but enhanced with centuries of storytelling and embellishment. Whether you believe in ghost ships or not, the core message remains relevant. Our choices have consequences. Our actions affect others. And sometimes the price we pay isn't immediate. Sometimes it comes decades later, when we've almost convinced ourselves we've gotten away with it. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We explore historical mysteries, legendary curses, and the strange tales that blur the line between history and myth. Leave a comment below and let me know what you think. Was the Phantom of Nassau real? Was it mass hallucination, divine justice, or just a story invented to explain why a quartermaster lived in fear for 40 years? And if you have your own ghost ship stories or encounters with the unexplainable, share them. The comments section is a place for all of us to explore these mysteries together. Until next time, remember what Captain Grimshaw knew. The sea is vast, ancient, and ultimately indifferent to human concerns. But it's also the ultimate witness. It sees everything. It remembers everything. And sometimes, just sometimes, it collects what's owed. Stay curious. Stay skeptical. But maybe on moonless nights when the fog rolls in, stay a little bit afraid too. Because some stories are more than just stories. Some legends have teeth. And the Phantom of Nassau, well, it may be gone from Nassau Harbor, but there are a lot of harbors in the Caribbean, a lot of moonless nights, a lot of fog rolling in from the endless sea. Who's to say where it sails now, or what it's searching for? Sweet dreams.